My name is Graham Dutfield, and I'd like to welcome you all to the third of the Voices for Biojustice webinar. If you have questions, I hope you have plenty of questions, and I'll make sure we have time for questions, about 30 minutes for questions, if not more. Please feel free to use the chat facility on the right, and I'll be taking notes of the questions. All right. So the theme of this is bringing the voices of Indigenous peoples and local communities into global policy arenas. Now, we've all probably read hundreds of pages on the CBD and Nagoya and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and UNESCO conventions. However, there's in some ways a bit of a disconnect between international negotiations and diplomacy and what happens at the local level. And of course, it's really important that indigenous peoples and local communities do have the space to, in a sense, do it for themselves. We have some people with immense experience of actually organizing such local activity. We have Philila Mbata from the University of Cape Town. We have Maui Solomon from New Zealand. And I'll introduce them probably in a moment when they each they're ready to speak. Ashish Kotari and Alejandro Argumedo. Ashish Kotari of Kalpovich and Alejandro Argumedo from Andes in Peru and the Swiss Foundation. Our first speaker, though, is Philila Mbata, is a lecturer in environmental and geographical science, University of Cape Town. She has more than 10 years experience conducting research on marine and coastal governance and livelihoods related topics in the Western Indian Ocean region of Southern Africa, particularly in the rural context. And she's pretty interested in researching fisheries, mining, tourism, as well as broader conservation of coastal resources. So Philila, would you like to share your wisdom with us, please?
Thank you so much for the introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Philila, has been introduced, and I'm based at the University of Cape Town. And I would like to thank everyone for joining. I know for some people like myself in South Africa, it's late at night. So it's really, really a pleasure to be able to present here. And I really want to thank everyone for joining. So my talk today, I'll just give a brief talk. I hope it doesn't take too long. It's making a case for local and customary governance systems in multi-level conservation governance. And this talk is inspired by a work that I've done as part of my PhD that was interrogating the governance of multi-level or multi-scalar conservation interventions that are situated at the international level but operate at the local level. And I'll be talking more about South Africa's very first World Heritage Site and the implications of governance within that context on local livelihoods. And the particular local community that I'll be looking at is a rural community, which is in the east coast of KwaZulu-Natal, which is in South Africa, where there are existing customary systems of governance that are operating on the coast, but that are competing with statutory interventions for conservation that are introduced by the governance as well as traditional authorities. So without further ado, okay, we can move to the next slide. So I'll just begin broadly by talking about different systems of governance where more than one exists, like South Africa. I focused a lot on interactive governance theory, which looks at the quality of interactions between different governance systems that might occur. 1972, and more than 190 countries are signatories to the to the convention. And South Africa promulgated its World Heritage Convention Act in 1998, a year before its first World Heritage Site was established in 1999, which is now known as the Simangaliso World Heritage Site. And this is quite interesting because South Africa became a democracy in 1994 after a long history of apartheid and colonial rule that were basically characterized by dispossession of majorities of people of color, especially in areas along the coast, who were not given opportunities to benefit from coastal environments or from natural resources in general. So in 1994, the democratic government sought to provide redress to a lot of the injustices that were done during the colonial and apartheid era. And some of those injustices include, some of those forms of redress included restituting land and access rights to people in rural areas, such as the ones that we'll be talking about today. So after 1994, there was a lot of excitement by people, especially where customary practices exist, that they'll be able to go back to those customary practices without any interferences. However, in this particular area in 1999, all of a sudden it was declared a World Heritage Site. So what I was interested in understanding is what that would mean for local people and how the voices of the local people were going to be integrated in such a multi-level global conservation intervention. And also, so just to give you more context, UNESCO has 3 types of World Heritage Sites. So you have natural sites that are protected just based on ecological characteristics. And then there are cultural sites, which can include monuments and buildings, and then mixed sites, which include a combination of both natural and cultural aspects. So a lot of natural sites are mostly found in the global south, whereas a lot of cultural sites are found in the global north. There's a lot of political ecology literature, well, not a lot, but quite a bit of literature that talks about why, that basically critiques the fact that a lot of natural sites are in the global south, whereas cultural sites are in the global north. But I'm not going to go into that in this talk because there's a whole other debate. But I find that to be quite an interesting question, and you will see why at the end of my presentation. But South Africa is a very important context that enables us to question or to interrogate, rather, the appropriateness of multi-scalar or multi-level conservation interventions, because South Africa, like many other post-colonial states, has a legal pluralistic context when it comes to governance. And governance is something that I'm really interested in because it does influence what people at the local level can or cannot do. So it's a very, very important thing to unpack and also to understand. So in South Africa, we do have legal pluralism that exists mostly between statutory and customary system. But we also have a third element of traditional authorities, which is not usually looked at within legal pluralism literature, which I'm going to touch on in the study, in this presentation. So can we go to the next slide? So a lot of literature on interactive governance, which basically I've drawn my definition of governance from, talks about contexts where you have statutory institutions that compete with customary institutions. And usually where this happens, there's a lot of conflicts, because when you have more than one system of governance, there's more likely to be conflicts and competition over issues of legitimacy, and also there are usually issues with accountability. So for instance, when conservation governance interventions are introduced in South Africa, that especially in rural areas, which is the context that I'm talking about, they are usually introduced within a context where there are already existing forms of governance, like customary governance or traditional governance, and obviously that creates problems. And one of the issues that becomes more prevalent in such context is the issue of power. So we can go to the next slide. So the role of power is really important because when you have an area that is being governed by multiple modes of governance and also at multiple levels, the assumption is that there's going to be seamless integration between the levels of governance and between the institutional arrangements. But this is not usually the case. So for instance, when UNESCO establishes World Heritage, when World Heritage Sites are established under UNESCO, there's usually an assumption that there's going to be seamless reporting from the global level all the way to the local level and vice versa. But the reality is that this is not as simple as is usually assumed. So for instance, in the UNESCO guidelines for the management of World Heritage Sites, they do state that indigenous peoples or indigenous communities should be included in decision-making processes about how World Heritage sites are conserved. And also domestically, South Africa, within our constitution and also within the World Heritage Convention Act, it is stipulated that communities, wider communities rather, are meant to benefit from decision-making processes, and they should be included. But the reality on the ground has not really mirrored what's been stipulated in these policies and these legal instruments. And this is something that I've been really interested in interrogating, because having a good policy or law is one thing that is inclusive, but if that is not happening on the ground, then we need to interrogate why that's not happening. And power issues and power struggles are usually what come out on top as one of the major hindrances that prevent that from happening. So we can go into the next slide. So this is just a map of South Africa for those of you who might not be familiar. And this particular map shows the different conservation areas along the coast of South Africa, which are marine protected areas. And the one that I'm interested in is on the northernmost coast of KwaZulu-Natal, on the east coast, which is Kosi Bay. I'm sure you can see it there. I can't really point on the presentation, but that big arrow there on your top right corner, which is Kosi Bay. So that area falls within Isimangaliso World Heritage Sites. It's a rural area, and in 1994, people were excited that there's going to be rural development. South Africa, in our National Development Plan, has a lot to say about plans for rural development and land restitution. However, being established, the establishment of the World Heritage Sites and that area being included in that has meant that some of those plans needed to be altered in order to suit the protection of the World Heritage Site. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a natural site, which means that a lot of the protection that is taking place is mostly because of the ecological attributes of the area and not so much the social aspects like the people and their customary practices and so on. Okay, we can move to the next slide. So obviously this becomes problematic, because not only because of now, the fact that this is mostly a rural area where there are pre-existing customary practices that are overshadowed by the protection of the area as a World Heritage Site. The other issue is the historical one, where, as I mentioned earlier, due to the histories of colonial and apartheid areas in South Africa, the people living in these areas have been progressively marginalized over the centuries and over the years. So when conservation is introduced at the global level in the democratic dispensation, it then raises questions around the appropriateness of that, and also about how will the voices and the needs of wider communities on the ground be integrated in such a global instrument for conservation that has been presented in this area. So that's something that I've been interested in looking at. So if you go to the next slide, I will zoom into the area that I'm talking about, which is Kosi Bay, which forms part of the Isimangaliso World Heritage Site. So as I've said, the site was declared in 1999 for its outstanding universal value, as it possesses ecological attributes that are considered unique at the global scale. It has 5 different ecosystems, but it's also a rural area where people are largely marginalized socially, politically, and otherwise. There are very poor economic opportunities, poor job opportunities, education opportunities. People in this area have a long history of relying on fisheries and agriculture for livelihoods, even though sectors such as tourism have come in much later. But fisheries and agriculture have been the backbone of livelihoods of the people in this area. And fisheries in this area is also quite different. They use a system of fishing called a fish trap system, which is basically fish traps that are built within the estuary and the lakes that exist in the area. And basically fish traps are built by individual families in the community. And the idea is that the fish are trapped into the trap, and then the fishermen will go at the end of the day to check how many fish were inside their traps. So it's quite a different type of fishery, which I believe is found in other parts of the world as well as agriculture. But these customary activities, or livelihood activities rather, have been implicated upon by the establishment of the World Heritage Sites, because during the apartheid era, when conservation was first introduced in the area, the government tried to prevent people from conducting these activities, even though fisheries remained stronger in that the governments didn't really wipe it out at the time. But agriculture as a livelihood has sort of dwindled over the years because of conservation rules. And with the entrenchments of World Heritage Site rules, it's become much more difficult for people to engage in these livelihood activities because the argument is that since it's a World Heritage Site, there has to be minimal human impact within the sites, which obviously implicates on people's livelihoods. We can move to the next slide. So one of the biggest issues in this particular area is the fact that at the local level, there are customary institutions that have existed for a long time that have been responsible for the continued sustainability of fisheries and agricultural activities in the area. However, customary institutions compete with statutory institutions, and in this particular case, government institutions responsible for conservation, as well as traditional authorities. Now, this is also a historical thing, because traditional authorities were basically, that system was entrenched by colonial and apartheid governments. And what they did in rural areas is that they worked with they established traditional authorities and worked with them as allies, and customary institutions that were bona fide sort of structures within rural areas that were responsible for regulating day-to-day practices of local people were undermined during the colonial era and the apartheid era, and they still remain undermined now. So even though they are aware of people's needs and practices, they don't really have a say in decision making. Instead, what happens is when, for instance, the World Heritage Site was introduced, the traditional authorities were the only ones that were included in the decision-making body, with the assumption that traditional authorities represent everyone. So if you've included the chief, you've included the whole community. And that's been really problematic, because what's coming out is that the views and the needs of the local people are still not understood within decision-making processes concerning the sites. When I conducted research in the area, there was clear evidence that people don't feel that their needs are represented in the decision-making processes pertaining to the World Heritage Sites. And that was a little bit confusing at first, because we were like, oh, the traditional authority is part of the decision-making body, but it turned out that people don't recognize traditional authorities as customary leaders. And in fact, there are separate structures that exist in the community that are considered customary, structures responsible for customary leadership that are very involved, for instance, in the fisheries sector in the area, as well as in other issues relating to land. So in such a system where customary structures have to compete with other more powerful structures, then it becomes difficult for the voices of local people to be integrated in decision-making processes. Given also the fact that, you know, UNESCO sits at the international level, and there was no clear evidence that they are aware that there were customary practices of communities that were being wiped out because of the existence of the World Heritage Sites. Okay, we can move to the next slide. So this slide is not really meant for you to understand, but it basically shows how the history of traditional and customary institutions in rural areas in South Africa is very, very complex. And this is something that is important to point out, because there's a huge assumption by conservation agencies in South Africa that if you go to a rural area and you've spoken to a chief, then you've captured the voice of the whole community. And that's not necessarily the case. There's a lot of research from other people and other colleagues that's showing that traditional authorities don't always represent the voices of wider communities, but instead there are actually local level customary institutions in places like Kosi Bay and others as well in South Africa and other parts of the world that are more representative. We can go to the next slide. So customary institutions are very important, and this slide is taken from work some of the work done by Jackie Sande, who's my colleague, who did work before myself in Kosi Bay. And this picture shows the design of the fish traps that the people are using in Kosi Bay. And I'm showing this picture because one of the scientists who's responsible for conservation in the area was arguing that the fish trap system is no longer sustainable in scientific terms. But then communities argue that actually they are sustainable because over the years they've modified the design of the fish trap to make sure that it's continually sustainable. So for instance, there was a point where fish traps were capturing smaller fish than the people wanted. So instead they made the spaces between the traps much bigger in order to rectify that. So over the years, people have been adapting the system to make it sustainable. But the assumption that is usually made by governments is that people don't understand, or maybe people are not inclined to care about conservation, which is not necessarily true. People have their own customary interpretations of what it is to conserve resources that is not usually recognized by Western scientific modes of governance, such as what is happening within the World Heritage Sites. So in order to conclude, there's a lot that I can say on this topic, but one of the questions that I've always asked myself when doing this research, and when people ask me, so how can we ensure that the voices of these local people are included in such a situation where you have multi-level governance of the World Heritage Site, and also at the local level you have legal pluralism? And for me, what stood out is, you know, when we're talking about World Heritage Sites under the World Heritage Convention, we need to ask ourselves whose heritage is being protected. Is it the heritage of UNESCO or of the government? Because I don't think it's the heritage of the people, since a lot of people in this area, for instance, English is not their first language. And many of them told me they don't even know what World Heritage mean or what it means to be in a World Heritage Site, because they were not formally or properly consulted when it was established. So then it raises a lot of questions about, you know, because there are reports that this World Heritage Site is one of the best managed World Heritage Sites in South Africa. But then I asked myself, what's that based on? Because this World Heritage Site is ticking boxes when it comes to ecological conservation and when it comes to making economic profits from tourism, but it's not ticking the box of meeting the social or the livelihoods aspects of local people, or supporting rather the livelihoods of local people. And I believe that livelihoods analysis are really important in terms of helping us understand whether or not conservation interventions, especially such as these ones, are successful. And in this particular case, the customary practices of local people have not been well integrated in the governance of the World Heritage Sites. And it was not clear to me from an institutional point of view, when I was looking at the institutional arrangements governing the sites, all the way from the international level coming down to the local level, it's not clear. There are no clear avenues to see where the voices of local people are supposed to be inserted. As I've said, that customary structures are completely overshadowed by traditional authorities as well as state agencies in rural areas. And yeah, so I will conclude. We can go to the next slide. So these are just some of the questions that I'm working on when it comes to international organizations like UNESCO, that they have to think about the appropriateness of promoting conservation interventions in areas with deep histories of colonialism and apartheid in the case of South Africa. And governments in places like South Africa need to recognize the plural systems that exist of governance, such as traditional authorities versus customary institutions versus state institutions, because that creates conflicts and competition. And as long as the government doesn't clarify the roles of what does it mean to have a World Heritage Site in an area that's been demarcated for rural development, as long as the government doesn't clarify that, we're going to have a lot of problems when it comes to promoting conservation. So I will just end it here, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really fascinating for you. What I will do now is briefly introduce Maurice Solomon. And so for 30 years, Maurice Solomon was a legal advocate for the rights of indigenous peoples in various forums around the world. but most recently he's been involved with his own people, the Moriori iwi, iwi of in New Zealand. So I think I'm just going to say no more because for many he needs no introduction anyway. So over to you, Maui.
Ata pano, greetings everybody from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and also Rekohu. So as Graham said, I've spent most of my legal career as an advocate for Moriori, my own tribal people from Rekohu, Chatham Islands. That's an island 800 miles east of New Zealand. I've also been an advocate for Māori tribes over the years, in particular the Y262 claim. Some of you will be aware of that claim, and after all these years, finally the government's starting to do something about that. That claim was in relation to Indigenous flora and fauna and associated cultural and intellectual property rights. So I've spent a lot of time attending international conferences and meetings, as well as regional ones, Convention of Biodiversity, UNDRIP, WIPO, and I've certainly learned a lot from that and met a lot of good friends and colleagues, many of whom are on this call today. And I think international advocacy for Indigenous peoples, traditional local communities is very important. But I've found in my personal experience, and I think the experience of many other Indigenous peoples, is that whilst there's a lot of talk about recognising and protecting Indigenous and traditional knowledge and know-how, it's mostly talk, and these processes can go on for a very, very long time without achieving little. I think the UNDRIP process, at least we got a declaration, and that's a very good declaration, but it took 30 years to achieve. I've observed at WIPO, it started out with good intentions, and almost 25 years later, that whole process is all about protecting the status quo, that is existing intellectual property rights. So, and I've seen a similar scenario playing out at a national level. So basically those in power, whether it's at a national or international level, those nation states are mostly interested in protecting their own interests and those of the IPR and international corporates, etc. So I've decided about 10, 15 years ago to focus more of my energy and attention on building my own people's capacity back home on Rekohu. And just as a by way of background, Moriori are from central Polynesia. They're similar but different to Māori tribes. They're the Indigenous people of the island they named Rekohu, which means misty sun. They were originally a warrior people, but they set aside warfare, killing and cannibalism some 800 years ago and developed a covenant of peace among themselves and also with their environment. And that covenant of peace has remained unbroken to this day. Although we were colonised twice, firstly by Europeans and then secondly by two Māori tribes from New Zealand who went out there in 1835 in an English sailing ship, and effectively what happened to my people was genocide. So our population went from around 2,500 to 3,000 people. Within one generation, there were 100 people left. And then my grandfather, who died in 1933, Tommy Solomon, when he died, they declared Moriori to be extinct. And I was taught that at school growing up. So I grew up without my Moriori identity. And to have your land, language, liberty, and then your identity taken from you is a terrible thing. And so Moriori have spent the last 30 or 40 years reclaiming our identity in our place on the island, and that hasn't been without struggle. But we've recently signed a deed of settlement with the Crown, with the New Zealand government, and that restores some land rights to us, as well as financial compensation. It recognises that we're actually still a living people with a living culture, but we're in the process of reconstructing that culture. And so it's been a great revelation to go back home and work at the local level and to work with local agencies and central agencies. And we've developed very strong partnerships and relationships with like Department of Conservation, universities and museums in New Zealand, central government agencies, bringing together their know-how and knowledge with our own traditional know-how and knowledge. And we have developed our own code of ethics and guidelines based largely on the code of ethics and guidelines of the International Society of Ethnobiology, which I was a member of for many years. Just want to acknowledge here Dr. Daryl Posey, who was a great inspiration and leader in this field for many years. So yeah, most of my time and effort has been now directed at the local level, and I think that's where the real change is going to happen. Rather than just attending conferences and debating these things. As I said, that's important, but it's important to work at the local level and affect the change. So just by way of example, because we're time constrained, Moriori were agroforesters. They planted and managed large-scale forests, particularly Kopi forests. The Kopi tree produces a berry and a nut, and that nut provides carbohydrates to their diet. So they harvested literally hundreds of tons of these nuts from the Kopi tree. And they're also, if you just keep flicking through, Gabriella, they also carved living trees or engraved images onto the Kopi trees, and you can see on the screen that's one of them. And so the trees are very sacred to Moriori because the image they put on that tree, the belief is that that tree became a portal to the spiritual homeland. They may have also been markers of trees that produced particular high yielding crops. But of course, after colonization, most of those forests were destroyed, the carvings were lost, but there are still small pockets of these forests on the island. And there's a National Historic Reserve called Hapupu that's owned by and managed by the Crown, Department of Conservation. And it's been a historic reserve for about 30 or 40 years. But the forest was dying and the trees were dying with these images on it. So we just said to Department of Conservation, this is Moriori, the tribal organisation I represent as Hokotehi Moriori Trust. So we approached Department of Conservation and said, well, if you're not going to manage that forest, we're going to do it for you, because that's our obligation as the kaitiaki, as the guardians of that place. And we want you to do it with us, but if you're not, we're going to do it anyway. So that was us exercising our self-determination, but we were doing it for the right reasons. We engaged with Department of Conservation and they came alongside us. And we've been working in that space ever since, and also working in a whole lot of other spaces on the island. We've partnered up with University of Otago. We've produced 4 or 5 PhDs, half a dozen masters, and those that academic institution and those students keep contributing back to our cultural renaissance. And so, I guess in a nutshell, whilst advocacy at the international level is important, and at the regional level, and these instruments are important for using as leverage in your negotiations and discussions with government agencies, the real work happens at the local level, and to affect change there and get those people alongside you so that they understand where you're coming from. They can see that what you are advocating is not only of benefit to Moriori, but benefit to their cause, in this case conservation, but also has wider benefits for the community. So what's in the interests of Moriori is also in the wider interests of the Chatham Island community. So we've had some battles and struggles along the way, but overall we are winning the war, so to speak. And people now on the island can see where we're coming from, that we're not seeking to deny anyone else their place, whether they're Pākehā, European or Māori, but it's about trying to work together. So our focus is on upholding our own cultural values and philosophy, the covenant of peace, the values of inclusivity, of sharing, and other things that we are seeking to implement on the island. We've got a number of projects at the moment looking to establish a bio-circular economy down there to minimise or the number of imports coming into the island and the export of livestock and animals off the island. Let's build a more resilient Chatham Island community. Let's make better use of our waste streams, and we've got plans to plant millions of trees back on the island because the landscape's been denuded through farming practices over the years. And it's about giving back to the land. It's about giving back to the sea. It's about looking after the atmosphere the best way we can, and being better caretakers rather than just takers. Take. Because we're just robbing future generations if we keep doing that. So this is my wife, Susan, and I. These are some of our children in the Kopi forest. So fishing was very important on Rekuhu, down at the reefs, gathering kaimona or paua. And this is carving wānanga. So we see wānanga being like a workshop. So we're seeking to revive our skills and knowledge around carving and engraving trees. Taken in our meeting house. That's another one of the actual carving workshop. This is teaching in the Kopi Grove in the Kopi Forest about the practices of our ancestors, and they spent a lot of time living and just being in those forest spaces. And this is some of the land at our home at Manuko when we started planting trees on it about 8 years ago. We've recently been approved a grant to plant out 150 hectares, so that's 150,000 trees, native trees. So we're looking to bring back not just the trees, but also the native flora and fauna. And this is the final slide. That's just myself with my wife Susan and two of our children, Enimata, my daughter, on the right, and Tamaro Ariki on the left. So that's all I have to say today. That actual photograph was taken just after the signing of our historic deed of settlement at Kopinga Marae on Rekuhu in February of this year, just before lockdown happened. So thank you for listening, and greetings to all everybody who are on the call. Look forward to answering any questions you might have later. Thank you, Graham. Me rongo.
Thanks so much, Maui. That was, again, fascinating. Our next speaker is Ashish Kulkarni, who I've known for about 20 years, but we in fact, the last time we spoke was 20 years ago, so it's great to see you again. Ashish is a founder member of Kalpovich, member of many people's movements in India, but he's also, I think, been quite involved in international debate as well over the years. So I'll keep that brief so we get more of Ashish and less of me. So over to you, Ashish.
Thanks, Graham, and thanks to everybody, all the organizers, for this opportunity. It's great to go after Filile and Maui because a lot of the ground has already been laid in terms of the need for local action, local governance, for being able to recognize the agency of indigenous peoples and local communities. And I'm going to build on that and talk about also how there's a tremendous need to expand the scope of the work we're doing to fundamentally challenge the systems of oppression and unsustainability and exploitation and extractivism that we have in the world right now. And right now, in fact, is an incredible crisis that we're in, but also an incredible opportunity for us to maybe redirect the way in which our society, economy, and politics runs. So just as a quick bad news background, I think we're all familiar with the fact that the way in which we have thought of development, progress, wealth, and so on in the last few decades, or maybe since colonial times, has brought the world to a very, very severe edge of precipice, so to speak. Ecological crises, the crisis of livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people, and of course also cultural and other forms of homicide that have taken place around the world through colonial and up to now. And we can see a whole, all sorts of different neo-colonial ways of continuing this ecological and cultural damage across the world in the name of progress and development. And I think we clearly need to look for systemic, fundamental alternatives to this if we want the biological diversity of the planet and cultural diversity and human existence itself to continue or to thrive. So I'm going to look at what are these alternatives that attempt to sustain biocultural diversity and to sustain life itself in a few examples, especially from the context I'm in, which is in India, but also maybe a couple from outside. And to my mind, one of the most important things in order for us to protect or to create biojustice or biocultural justice is resistance against the kind of destructive development projects, whether it's mining or large hydroelectricity projects or big highways or whatever else is happening in the name of development, but also the fundamental structures underlying that, which is the domination of whether it's capitalism or statism, or of course much older masculinity, patriarchy, and so on, and the very phenomenon of anthropocentrism, or human beings considering themselves to be at the center of everything and displacing millions of other species. But at the same time, we also need constructive alternatives to meet people's needs, or for people to be able to meet their needs and aspirations without trashing the earth and without leaving half of humanity behind, without creating the kind of abysmal inequalities that we live in right now. And I'm going to give you 3 or 4 examples of where I think that's kind of happening and what we can learn from and be inspired from. So this is, to me, one of the most inspiring examples from southern India. This is a group of about 5,000 women farmers. And these are, for those of you who are familiar with the Indian caste system, they're the most oppressed caste of what's called Dalits, or so-called untouchables. So they're disprivileged in many different ways. Over the last 30 years, these women have brought back their traditional diversity of seeds, especially millets and local rice varieties and so on. They've collectivized a lot of their operations. They're sharing their own knowledge. They're sharing seeds. They've taken full control over the land and over the seeds and over water and so on. And essentially through all of this achieved what they say is food sovereignty. And this is such a crucial aspect of the attempt to try and reclaim one's life and one's lives and livelihoods. And through this kind of revolution over the last 30 years, they've also significantly changed their social status as women and as Dalits, which, as I said earlier, was severely oppressed. There are hundreds of examples of this kind in India, of communities reviving or sustaining both their agricultural diversity, but also the natural ecosystem diversity, wildlife, going out of their way to protect biological species, other species of plants and animals, or sustaining ecosystems, many of them in the face of very severe threats to their lives from the timber mafia or from the mining mafia or otherwise. And this is, of course, a global phenomenon. What some of us in the last 10, 15 years have been calling ICCAs, others like Alejandro will call them biocultural heritage sites, and there are many different names around the world. And what's very, very important here is the fact that they're numbering in tens of thousands and possibly cover as much, or if not more, than the total coverage of official government protected areas. And it's very important, especially given what, for instance, Philile was talking about the heritage site, that these are spaces where communities actually do have, indigenous peoples actually do have local governance control, unlike a lot of the others. And because of that, they're able to sustain not just their own cultures and livelihoods, but also the biological diversity in the area, and to resist destructive processes. Many of us know that about 10-15 years back, there was a significant shift in the way international institutions such as the IUCN and the CBD, Biodiversity Convention, about which Maui spoke, looked at protected areas and acknowledged the fact that protected areas, conserved areas, can also be governed by indigenous peoples and local communities, the blue shaded. And this was a very, very important shift in international policy, which has translated down to some national policy levels, and people are able to use those as tools wherever they can mobilize themselves to gain that protection. This is another example where I was there recently, a few months back, in the Ecuadorian Amazon, where the Sapara indigenous people are trying to protect their 600,000 hectares of territory from extractivism, mining, oil, and so on, and to assert their own way of being, way of living, way of understanding, way of relating to the local biological, the spirits of the plants and animals, the stones, the river, etc. Let me move to the last example and then come to what I think is the kind of framework of transformation that we need. This is again back to central India, where 90 villages have got together to assert not just the fact that they don't want mining and extractivism in their area, which is very, very important, but also that they want self-determination, that they want to self-rule, that they want to control the entire nature and natural resources of the area, but recognizing also that internally within themselves they have inequalities and divisions and hierarchies and conflicts, and that they need to deal with these through federations, through more collective people's assemblies, through empowering women to also have a voice, which is often not the case in a country like India, and asserting what they call a Swaraj in India, which means radical democracy or self-rule. So taking these and hundreds of other examples into account, we've come up with this kind of an alternative transformation framework or format, which essentially says that we need very radical change in 5 spheres if we're talking about biojustice or biocultural justice. One, as the central Indian villages are saying, we need radical democracy, which is to say it's not about going to elections once in 5 years or 4 years, but really controlling decisions where we are. Of course, also making, to the extent that the government or the state exists, making it accountable, but also starting to look at political decision making from an eco-regional or a bio-regional perspective, rather than the current political nation-state boundaries that we have, which cut across ecosystems and cut across cultures. The second important thing, which is what the Dalit women farmers are saying, is that for things that are basic to us, what is important for our basic needs, the local ecosystems, nature, natural resources, knowledge, etc., it has to be in our control. So economic democracy, and also thinking of economy not just in terms of money and so on, but in terms of caring and sharing and recognizing the invisible work of a lot of people, especially women. The third aspect there on the bottom right-hand side is about the struggles for equality, for equity, for social justice, especially along genders, sexualities, ethnicities in India, caste, and so on. Equally important, the fourth one on the bottom left-hand side is the sustenance of the cultural diversity and the language diversity that is so very crucial for us to be able to sustain ourselves. In India, for instance, there are 780 living languages. Each of them is a library of knowledge, each of them important for us to be able to overcome crises like the one that we're in, but all of them threatened with cultural homogenization or religious homogenization, as we are seeing right now. And the fifth sphere there, of course, is the most crucial one of sustaining the earth itself. At the core of this, what I would call the flower of transformation, is a set of values. And I think that really is the most important thing that I've learned from these local communities and indigenous peoples. What are the fundamental ethics, the principles on which we can sustain the earth and ourselves? And this set of ethics is so very different from what the dominant economic and political system tells us, which is about individualism and competition and hostility and so on. What these initiatives are telling us is that no, it's about the collectives, it's about the commons, it's about responsibility towards each other, it's about rights but also responsibilities, it's about saying not just human rights and our rights but also the rights of other species of nature. It's about autonomy, freedom, and so on and so forth. And I think if one is to create a global movement towards justice and sustainability, it needs to be based on understanding that these are the values that are common to us. Everything else is diverse. Your ideology and mine might be different. Your ecology and mine might be different. Your politics and mine might be different. Your economics and mine might be different. But we may have at the core of what we're trying to do this set of, or this and additional sets of fundamental ethics that will bind us together. So basically, worldviews that celebrate life. We call it eco-Swaraj in India. The notion of Swaraj, as I already told you, is about self-rule, but with responsibility towards everybody else. And there are similar value systems, ethics, worldviews, etc., in different parts of the world, many of which my fellow speakers here would, of course, be well aware of. On the right-hand bottom side is a book that we recently came out with, which has 100 such examples from of radical worldviews and practices from around the world. And we've just recently initiated something called the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, trying to weave together these different movements of radical alternatives, of conservation with rights, of sustaining cultures, etc., in a non-hierarchical, horizontal kind of way. So with that, I think I'm at the end. Just to say that I think if we really want to confront the kind of systems and structures we're up against, if we really want to get out of crises like COVID, not with things like state authoritarianism and state surveillance, but actually more and more solidarity and building from the ground up and creating a system in which, in fact, we don't have further such crises, then we need to be able to work together across the world, across cultures, across geographies, etc. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ashish. It's always interesting to know what's going on in India, and who better than you to tell us. Okay, our last speaker is Alejandro Agamedo, who comes from Peru, has studied ecological agriculture, and then in Canada, and then returned back to the Andean region to support indigenous food systems, which I'm sure he's going to explain why that's so important for indigenous peoples. And also, he's very much involved in giving some kind of substance to the concept of biocultural heritage. So over to you, Alejandro.
Thank you very much, Graham, and thank you to the organizers for the opportunity. And I'm happy to join this discussion. And as Ashish had mentioned, these are quite at times. I'm Quechua Indian from central Peru, and I come from a region that right now is tremendously impacted by this crisis. And before I start, I would like to ask you to go with me in a minute of silence for all the indigenous peoples in the Amazon, particularly the elders that have died just recently by this pandemic. And also for those killed by the World Bank projects, by the mining, oil, and other extractive industries that constantly abuse the rights of indigenous peoples, including like in their lives. So I would like to start this minute very fast. Thank you. Thank you. Now, This topic is bringing together this harsh reality, but also, as Ashish have mentioned, the opportunities that we have for a better world. And on this, the link between the realities of indigenous peoples, their entities, the different categories that they manage in relation to the knowledge and how that knowledge is used, particularly to build new options, new paradigms like buen vivir, and other ones around the world that are associated with traditional societies is key, as Ashish has discussed. And to do this, I would like to, first of all, start by quickly making this connection into the worldviews of indigenous peoples that derive from these cosmologies and how those values and principles that Ashish had mentioned are crafted from those cosmologies and are used to manage to create rules in terms of how they will manage the different relations they have with the environment and the institutions. So the cosmovision of indigenous peoples make us see or help us to see how they place themselves in this universe, a universe that puts people together with the rest of entities in nature. So peoples are not separated from nature. And I'm using for this conceptual graphic of an Indian chronicler from the 1500s who created this graphic to explain how people conceive their environment and all their relationships, the connections with all the universe. So to create a paradigm of living that we call it summa causae, where a balance was needed between what is in the realm of the spirit, what is in the realm of nature, and what is in the realm of humans. So to capture this, the characterization and the taxonomy of the different and the place of each one of these elements creates a correlation, and that correlation, the rules of engagement, which becomes customary laws. So in our case, the upper circle represents the sacred, the middle circle represents the wild, and the lower circle, the red one, represents humans. And we need a balance to achieve buen vivir, that we call it summa causae. So that has been the objective of indigenous societies in pre-Hispanic times, so that organically and in connection with the rest of beings that exist in life, we can create a relationship of balance. So let me explain this with a case in Peru of the potato park, to which I'm closely related. But beginning this by saying that it is this connection between the principles and the practice that makes traditional knowledge very spiritual. And that's a category that makes indigenous knowledge unique. So In the case of the potato park, which is an association of communities in central Peru that was established in the 2000, and one of the features or characteristics of these experiences that they keep close to 1,400 different varieties of potatoes, the highest diversity in the world. But by creating an approach towards food sovereignty, they also created a method to protect traditional knowledge as integral part of a larger neighborhood that is focused on food. And this food neighborhood is managed and is conceived and managed following those rules, following those principles and values that are associated to buen vivir. And to do this, we capture from the local reality of high presence of food crops to how those can be protected, how the defense of rights associated to genetic resources, to traditional knowledge, to the institutions, to rights associated to water, food-producing habitats, the land, above all, comes together when there is an integral approach to the protection of traditional knowledge. So for this, each one of those requires a sovereign approach to sovereignty, but how you get that sovereignty and how you exercise it may be different and maybe can be captured at different levels. So this multiple sovereignties at different scales is what makes the approach of the potato park unique. And how that's acquired and exercised, for instance, by creating a governance system where also the mountains, who are protectors, gods, also participate in the governance of the landscape. So in this case, the authorities of the potato park are two sacred mountains, one female and one male. And then the wise elders also choose the different types of mountains, or the different mountains that will have different roles, like pasture, be in charge of pasture, or water, or medicinal plants, etc. Also, by protecting the landscape, we are protecting the home, in this case of potatoes, of other type of crops, so that a continuous evolution or co-evolution of this crops can continue. In this way, new genetic expressions appear, which are the product of this association between culture, the ecology, and the genetic resource. This also allows for people to continue exploring, experimenting through different types of plant breeding that are not related to, genetic engineering or any modern plant breeding, but rather a type of evolutionary plant breeding. See, the exchanges are quite active. We also look at the impacts on the diversification of crop production. The potato park have restored diversity through repatriation or rematriation of a set of 400 potatoes from the International Potato Center, with the addition of establishing rights over those genetic resources. The promotion of different types of crops that continue to be important, the creation of livelihood options where traditional knowledge is used to create different types of dishes, different types of products, and the use of collective trademarks and branding to protect those types of innovations. Also, the direct participation in international policy fora, be it the CBD, be it the international treaty, or be it independently depositing seeds in the Svalbard seed vault as indigenous peoples, make sure that these sovereign rights, the recognition of the sovereignty, goes directly to the community. The different types of research and linkages with other territorialities are very important, as food sovereignty is very much an issue of how you interlink different different efforts that different communities are making. So indigenous biocultural heritage allows, in this case, to, people to keep using their own knowledge as and their own cosmovisions and the knowledge for planning spatial or production systems, to keep managing the territorialities, to creating connectivity and autonomy, to enforce customary laws in their own affairs, and to create new types of rights that expand, it goes beyond human rights. There's the interrelation to customary laws for managing specific aspects of knowledge systems, and customary laws have that flexibility that is profound and can respond to the many challenges that intellectual property may pose. So in this work, we think that one is that all the laws and policies that have been created internationally don't work mostly for indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples are engendering more egalitarian, diverse, and just systems, like Ashish have presented some. Same thing is happening in the Andes, so that the relational scale approach is important because it links the specific objectives of indigenous peoples in terms of how they want to use their knowledge locally and self-organize the management of their territories. And that creates a continued experimentation and evolution, and creates this link that we need in terms of how bring together the epistemic and the ontological to nurture other worlds, because other worlds are possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Excellent as usual. Now, it's time for some questions, and I'm trying to sort of distill questions and make sure everybody gets one question. So there's a question from Harriet Deacon for Filili in relation to the World Heritage Convention, and how it's saying that there's a new group that's set up intended to highlight the voices of indigenous peoples and local communities. And she wondered sort of whether you think it will help. Okay.
So I think that's a great question. And I think you're talking about the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on World Heritage. And I think they've done a lot of work to sort of push organizations such as the World Heritage, UNESCO, that is in charge of World Heritage, to integrate the voices of indigenous people. And this is something that only happened around 2017, which is a long time after, obviously, the World Heritage Convention was established. And even though I think this is great because it means that there is discourse and talk at the global level about the significance of integrating the voices of Indigenous people in the management or governance of World Heritage, I think the issue is an issue of vertical and horizontal integration from an institutional as well as a legal perspective, because in as much as that's happening at the global level, how then that translates in domestic contexts is another issue. Because in South Africa, for example, we've had it within the World Heritage Convention Act since around 1998 that wider communities such as Indigenous people should be part of decision-making platforms regarding World Heritage sites. But this is something that we haven't seen happening yet. And my research showed that in this particular case, this assumption that involving traditional authorities in decision-making means they should involve everyone in Indigenous, in places where there are Indigenous people. And this is problematic because it's not necessarily the truth. So there is a need to recognize what that would mean in different contexts, because Indigenous people all over the world are diverse and they represent diverse needs and also they are characterized by diverse voices. So I think we need to think about what that will mean in different contexts where different World Heritage sites exist. Because just one thing that I want to mention is that the World Heritage Convention separates World Heritage sites as natural or cultural, which is quite problematic because many Indigenous people don't see the difference. They don't differentiate between nature and culture. Kosi Bay, for instance, the case study that I showed you is an area that is very rich in nature and culture. So for UNESCO to come and only protect its natural attributes as if the cultural ones don't exist, or having those not being acknowledged in the World Heritage Site governance is quite problematic. So we need to entangle all of those issues if we are really serious about integrating the voices of Indigenous people. And that will work out differently in many different parts of the world where World Heritage Sites exist. So just to answer your question, I think it's great, but I think it needs to be properly integrated and thought of in terms of how it will translate in different contexts.
Thank you very much. I have a there's a question from Anirudh Kishore for Ashish. You may have read it. It's quite a long question, but Anirudh says, one of the most powerful forms of resistance to the restructuring of government administrative frameworks and the redistribution of power across the hierarchies is the structure itself and not isolated problems within it. So how do you understand inducing changes from within the system as opposed to the need for a radical reform in governance?
Yeah, I think I've understood the question, but if not, then he can let me know. I think that we need to work at both levels. We need to work at changing the system itself. I don't think simply tweaking the system or reforming it is going to be adequate for us in the kind of crisis we are. We need very fundamental systemic change, as kind of indications that I was giving. I mean, for instance, I don't believe that you can have green capitalism or green growth. It's a contradiction in terms. And I think that we need a fundamental change in the nature of the nation state itself. It's too centralizing in the way it is right now. But having said that, I also know that these are long-term changes. So in the short term, we have to keep working within the system to see what are the spaces that can be created. For instance, working with the international institutions to create a stronger basis for both biological and human rights, for biocultural rights, etc., as has been done through the CBD or UNESCO and so on. And within our own countries, for instance, from India, I can think of laws like the Right to Information Act, or creating greater accountability of the state towards the people, or I think one of the most important ones, the Forest Rights Act, which overturned 200 years of colonialism, in which the forests were controlled centrally through a government department, and now the opportunity for people to be able to reclaim their governance rights and use rights over the forest, which was the basis for one of the examples that I gave you, where the community has empowered itself. But let's be very clear that anything, even a law as radical as that, when it starts getting used widely by people and the state starts getting shaken in its power, it will hit back and it will try and not implement the law. That law has been in place for the last 12, 13 years. Only about 5% of its potential has been actualized on the ground, for the simple reason that the Forest Department in India does not want to give up its power. Bureaucracy doesn't want to give up its power. And so eventually, to my mind, unless we change the nature of the state itself, change the nature of politics in the way we see it, I think these things of trying to work within the system will be very partial as answers.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Ashish. I'm trying to sort of put together the questions of two people. One with Preston Hardison, who had a number of quite interesting questions, but we don't have a lot of time. And also, pardon me if I mispronounce the name, but Vila Vaiko Hervalor. Basically, these questions about difficulties between, you have indigenous worldviews and you have these amazing activities that are going on at the local level. How do indigenous worldviews, how can, rather than situation where you have international rules and let's implement these rules, how does the influence and the shaping of and the design of policies work the other way? How do indigenous peoples, how can they be more effective, perhaps through their own national governments, get a better accommodation of their worldviews, the cosmovisions, etc., and their practices at the international level? Perhaps that's a question I could target to both to Maui and to Alejandro. So could I ask Maui if you could deal with this particular matter first, and then then we can hand over to Alejandro.
Okay, thank you, Graham. Yeah, look, in the years that I attended international fora, I always tried to take with me, my local knowledge from Rekohu, my own set of Moriori values, and advocate those within the international forum, because unless you can speak from the heart and not just from the mind to those people, they won't understand you. And so there has to be a direct connection between what you're doing at the local level and what's happening at the international level. Now, obviously, there's a huge disconnect, because one's just a big talking session and a lot of paper shuffling, and the other is actually implementing the reality at the ground level. But you can convey, I think, quite successfully, as Alejandro, in his presentation, what's happening in the potato park there in Peru, and able to then articulate those qualities and those values, because they are, they cut right across. Same with most Indigenous people's experiences, taking those to international level and advocate it. And actually, it works the other way too, bringing the knowledge that you gain at a regional, international level and bringing it back home. The problem for Indigenous people, of course, is that these member state representatives often have their ears blocked and their minds blocked and their hearts closed. And that's the real difficulty we have. And that's why these processes take decades and decades, because there is not the will to make these changes. And actually, Indigenous people, what was happening with COVID and climate change and the degradation that's happening around the planet, the world really needs to wake up and see that Indigenous peoples, traditional local communities have the means, have the tools, have the know-how, combined with technological and scientific knowledge to help save our planet. And until these industrialized nations, until the world wakes up to that reality, to see that what we're advocating is not just for our own benefit, but for the benefit of the planet and humanity. It's only then that we'll start getting somewhere. It's only then that these international talk fests will actually start making some real progress. And you know, almost 30 years WIPO, it's actually quite shameful the way that process has gone, despite great advocacy from Indigenous peoples and others representing Indigenous interests. There's just been a hell of a lot of paper shuffling and not a lot of progress. So as I say, the real impact happens at the ground level, and that's now where my energies are directed to affect the change there. And it's been far more effective than trying to convince you know, people at a national or even an international level.
Thanks very much, Maui. So the last word is really with, well, I'll have to wrap up at the end, but is Alejandro. So I wonder if you could also share your reflections, please, as well. Thank you.
Okay, I think Maui have laid the ground for how this should be approached. And I also believe that we got to put more effort into creating alternatives at a local level, which must be connected, because it is this interconnection among communities that's going to create the momentum and the possibility to respond. Nonetheless, actions at the national and international level are also needed. I don't know how much how much important is to keep participating in the CBD or WIPO or FAO. I think if NGOs will stop participating in them, they will put more pressure than, you know, being in there and playing the game of the powerful. And I think there's a need to create alternative forums where we could share experiences, information, and keep crafting strategies for you know, strengthening these local experiences. And having said that, like, the challenge is very, very big. It's a daunting task. We see how governments now are implementing the recovery plans. There's more extractive industries being allowed into the Amazon. There's more mining operations. So we're going to see a big wave of abuses on the rights of Indigenous people. So the response to that has to be, you know, creating solidarity and new ways of alliance building.
Thanks very much, Alejandro. Okay, that's really the end. So before you all go, I'd like to thank all of you for taking part and asking your questions. I'd like to thank our speakers, Filili, Maui, Ashish, and Alejandro, and to Rachel Weinberg, Sarah Laird, and Gabrielle Alvarez, without whom none of this would have been possible. So thank you all so much, and have a good afternoon, morning, evening, or wherever you are in the world. So thank you very much.